Welcome to Calvary Fellowship in Manchester, New Hampshire. We meet here in Manchester every Sunday to worship in song and in the Word of God. We hope you are encouraged by the music and the teaching.
Great are you, Lord, mighty in strength. You are faithful, you will ever be. We will praise you all of our days. It's for your glory, we offer everything. Raise your hands, all you nations, shout to God, all creation. How awesome is the Lord Most High. We will praise you together, for now and forever. How awesome is the Lord Most High.
Well, today we're going back into John after having Mother's Day last week, but they tie together nicely because this first miracle is going to be at a wedding of all places. And the reason we have that in there is the importance of marriage in the eyes of the Lord is such that the first miracle he does at a wedding, honoring marriage. And of course, that ties in, if we go back to Genesis, we realize when God created man, he says, not good that man be alone. But that isn't all he recognized. He recognized that man was unique in the hierarchy of creation, that no other created living thing would be comparable to man. Contrary to what they want to teach in evolution today, that, we're all of equal value, whether you're the lowest insect or man, we're all sort of on an even plane. That isn't what God did. God created man separately, created man, breathed life into him, breathed a soul into him, so man was unique. So none of the animals could have fulfilled the helpmeet role that man needed. So God knew that. So he took the woman from the man, rather than creating another human being. And as a result of doing that, of course, man was no longer complete. Since man was made in God's image originally, when you take part of that away, man is no longer complete. Only the woman could complete him because they now have different characteristics. Part of what would have been man is now part of woman, and that's why if you have conflicts between men and women, it's because obviously we have been separated from the same creation and we have different strengths and weaknesses that we're all in the unified body designed in God's image. And this new person, of course, Adam recognized right away as being bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh in Genesis 2:23, and he called her woman because she was taken from man. And she's the only one that could be the perfect helpmate for man. But not leaving anything to chance, God provided instructions for the continued use of this new person. In Genesis 2:24, he says, for this reason, a man shall leave his mother and father and cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one. Whereas God says the only way it's going to work is if we put them back together. Because I took them apart, but for them to function properly, to be in God's image, where it says he created man and woman in his image, they have to be a unity. They have to be put back together again. So it came with instructions. You have to join. And of course, they looked at each other and said, what's a mother and father, right? He said, for this cause you leave your mother and father. They didn't have any mother and father. But that instruction is there, and people sort of gloss over that. Say, well, obviously marriage really isn't that important anymore. But God, not man, created marriage. People want to tell you that, well, marriage was an institution created by society. It was a way of keeping track of people for tax purposes, for census purposes. No, God created marriage. The very first thing he did after he created man and created woman and created marriage, right there on the spot. He said, I didn't create you to be two separate people, to be independent of each other. I created you to come back together again, to be one, become one flesh. And you can't, obviously, when you put that people back together in that one, you can only become one with one person. Contrary to serial marriages that people have, or they're only married to one person at a time, but they're married to like 7 or 8 people during their lifetime. That doesn't work. You can only become one with one person. And that's what he intended. So he affirmed that when he asked him about divorce in Matthew chapter 19, verses 4 to 6. And if you turn there, you see that God made a point of the fact that that was marriage that he created. Because people say, oh, well, he just said, they come together and become one, but he didn't really create such an institution. But he really did, because in chapter 19 of Matthew, when he asked specifically about divorce, because we know what had happened, just as our society today, people started making it easier and easier to get divorced. Well, Moses allowed divorce, and he said, is divorce allowed for just any reason? Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason, which is what we have today. We have what we call no-fault divorce. So you don't have to give a reason. What it really is the hardness of people's hearts. They've reached the point where they're not willing to try. They're not willing to make an effort. So no matter how much counseling you give them, they're not going to change. They've already made up their mind. So that's the irreconcilable difference. And because we use that as a basis, you cannot save your marriage no matter what you do. Because if you ask for reconciliation and the other person wants divorce, that's the biggest irreconcilable difference you can have, so they grant a divorce. So it's impossible for people, contrary to what the church wants them to do, to have any standing with the court to save their marriage once this ball gets rolling. It's going to happen. They're going to grant a divorce. So they asked Jesus specifically about this, and he answered and said to them in verse 4, have you not read that he who made them in the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So he quotes that very creation of marriage and shows that is marriage that God created. It's not to be resolved by divorce. And in verse 6 he says, so then, they are no longer two but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let not man separate. So it's quite clear that man does not have the authority to grant divorce. We don't have the authority to leave our marriage, because he said, if God joined you together, then that's it. Let not man put asunder that which God has joined. You can't separate that which God has already done. Unfortunately, we, being of a sinful nature, find ways around that. And of course, for years, the only basis was adultery, because that's what God had said. He said only for sexual immorality. So for years, adultery was the only recognized cause for divorce, and so they had a whole business of setting up what looked like adulterous situations just so people could get a divorce. And it was phony, but it was a way of people getting around it. But since people don't have to confront what they're doing, it's just like everything else society does. If you change the words or you make it sound easier, people salve their conscience and they don't really acknowledge what they're doing. That God said, we joined you, I made you one. Don't separate that which God joined together. So we get around that by making it sound a lot easier. It's just irreconcilable differences, just who we are. Even when I was doing Catholic nullities for the Chancery, they're actually granting them based on psychological incompatibility. Not how that flies in the face of what God said, but not only did they not have fault-based divorce, they had an out for everybody. Well, you might be the right person for somebody else, but you weren't the right person for this person. Well, I don't know, you should have thought of that before you ever got married. And that's part of the problem, is we don't equip people for marriage. We require driver training. We don't require marriage training. We have sex education in schools, but we don't teach anybody about marriage. And it's sort of hit or miss. People learn on their own, and that's not what's supposed to happen. But on the flip side of that, God gets blamed for an awful lot of marriage that he had nothing to do with. It says, whomsoever God joins together. So what we learn from that is, obviously, you don't go out to find a mate. You allow God to do it for you. God has the right person out there for you. And all too often, people rush into marriages for the wrong reasons. It's usually a selfish reason. They've got a void in their life and they want to fill it. And that's particularly true after divorce. People will get married again and make the same mistake over and over again. As a social worker one time, I had a lady who had a master's degree, and she'd been married 3 times. All 3 times she married construction workers who were high school dropouts, and all 3 times she met them in the same bar. I said, if you haven't figured out anything yet, at least go to a different bar. We'll start from there, and then we'll work, then work back and figure the other problems you have. But obviously, the major problem they had is you get into the marriage for a while, she couldn't stand his friends, he couldn't stand her friends, because they were in 2 different worlds.